Sudetenland and appeasement. As the League of Nations began to crumble, politicians had to find a new way to keep the peace, and the policy that the Western powers came up with has been called appeasement. Appeasement is particularly associated with Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain just prior to the war. Now, the idea of appeasement was that if you give Hitler if you give in to some of his more reasonable demands, then maybe he would stop, maybe he would move his country back from a war footing. Some people think that the idea behind appeasement was that Hitler was a reasonable man. As a matter of fact, appeasement was a bit more complicated than that. To go to war, you need to have the approval of the people in your country. You can be the most ruthless dictator in history, but if the people don't want to go to war, they won't. So the idea was that if we could calm down the anger of the German people, if we could give in to some of their more reasonable demands, then Hitler wouldn't be able to go to war. He would lose the support of his people. So appeasement wasn't just predicated on the idea that Hitler was a reasonable man. The idea was that if we could calm the German people down, then we wouldn't go to war. Appeasement's most notorious moment was 1938 in the Czechoslovakia crisis. Basically what happened, to summarise it very, very simply, 1938, Germans living in the border areas of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, basically began to insist on union with Germany. The Czech government refused, and Hitler threatened war. Britain then, with France and a few other powers, came together in the Munich Agreement, and without asking Czechoslovakia, they agreed to hand the Sudetenland over to Germany. One thing that's very important to keep in mind here, this becomes very confusing because students are wondering, well, what are all these Germans doing living in Czechoslovakia? What are all these Germans doing living outside Germany? After the Second World War, there was a huge effort to make sure that peace would be lasting. And during that time, Germans, if you spoke German, if you were German national, you were forced back into the territory of Germany. And if you were a Czech, you were forced back into Czechoslovakia. The technical term for this is ethnic cleansing, but there was a massive amount of ethnic cleansing after World War II. Prior to World War II, you would find people who identified themselves as German living all over Europe, some of them living as far away as Russia, some in Italy, some in Czechoslovakia, some in France, the provinces Alsace and Lorraine. Germans had travelled the world, as had Italians, Hungarians, and people lived in each other's... People from different nationalities lived within different territories. This caused an awful lot of tension. And after World War II, there was quite a ruthless amount of ethnic cleansing, where people were just forced out of other... If you weren't part of the nationality of the country you were living in, you were forced back into that country. But prior to World War II, there were a lot of Germans living in different countries around the world. Like I said, Italy, but Hitler had no quarrel with Italy, so he never stood up for the rights of German-speaking people in Mussolini's Italy. The Sudetenland was different. The Sudetenland was on the border with Germany. It had a lot of fortresses, it had a lot of arms factories, it had a lot of the raw materials that Hitler needed for his war machine. It was also populated mainly by German-speaking people. And Hitler was fairly insistent that he wanted that territory for himself. And this was merely part of his war aim. He needed it because he wanted to go to war. 1938, the 9th of May. Now, you don't need to remember exact dates. It's just so that you have a chronology. It's just so you have the sequence of events in your head. But the 9th of May, 1938, Hitler visited Rome. And he visited Mussolini, and he got an agreement that Mussolini would stay out of any argument between Czechoslovakia and Germany. 28th of May, and this becomes very important. You remember that Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. Well, on the 28th of May 1938, Hitler began constructing a line of fortresses on the River Rhine, on the Rhineland. This was called the West Wall. And the reason he was constructing this huge series of fortresses was to stop France from invading Germany. About 500,000 Germans went to work on that project. Now, at that stage, France did begin to worry. It was a defensive move on the part of Germany, but what it was really doing is was preventing the French government from interfering with the German army. On August then, Hitler began his plans to bring the Sudetenland into Germany. He told Konrad Heinlein, the leader of the Sudeten Nazis, to rebel and to demand that the Sudetenland would have a union with Germany in the same way that Austria had. So really they were asking for a form of Anschluss. They were saying, we want to be part of Germany. Now the Czechoslovakian government could not afford to give up the Sudetenland. I mean, they simply could not continue to survive because their key fortresses were there. The chief threat was from Germany. Most of their fortresses protecting them from Germany were in the Sudetenland. Most of their arms factories were there. They knew they could not survive without the Sudetenland. So what Hitler was saying basically was, right, Heinlein, I want you to get your Nazis to cause hassle, to cause riots, to argue with the Czech government, and you have to demand something that they can't give. You wanted to leave Czechoslovakia, and you want to be part of Germany. The chief of the German army in August, Ludwig Beck, actually was so alarmed by this that he resigned. He understood that Hitler wanted a war. That's why you're building the fortresses. That's why you've got an agreement with Mussolini. Beck was really, really worried. He resigned. The guy who took over from Halder also thought about actually toppling Hitler in a military coup, though in the long run he decided not to. But this caused the German army a lot of worry. They hadn't finished rearming. They weren't yet ready to fight France and Britain. This was a huge gamble. Well, the crisis then begins to escalate. The 12th and 13th of September 1938, Hitler made a huge speech on the 12th of September about the Sudetenland, and that triggered riots and among the German people living in the Sudetenland. And they rioted against the Czech government. The Czechs, under Edvard Beneš, they declared martial law. Martial law means the army are taking over from the police. Soldiers are now policing the country. If you riot, you're likely to be shot. But that gave Hitler the excuse he wanted. He said, right, I'm going to protect the German-speaking people of Czechoslovakia. I'm going to get ready to invade. So he threatened war. At this stage, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, stepped in. And he actually went to see Hitler in the Berchtesgaden. Chamberlain had never even been on a plane before, but he decided to come over to try to get peace, to try to arrange peace. Hitler's demand actually seemed reasonable because at the end of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty had basically said that people should be allowed to vote to say which country they went into. People should have some control over their own destiny. And Hitler was essentially just saying, well, the German people of the Sudetenland should have the same rights that the Allies give everybody else at the end of the First World War. So his demand seemed reasonable. So Chamberlain arrived to see Hitler. German crowds actually cheered Chamberlain on his arrival, and that begins to give Hitler a moment of doubt, because what is happening is the German people are saying, listen, we don't want war. We don't mind you sending troops into the Rhineland because there were no shots fired. We don't mind the German army going into Austria because, again, there were no shots fired. There wasn't a battle, there wasn't a war. But at this stage, it began to look like war was possible, and the German people didn't want one. And they actually cheered Neville Chamberlain when he arrived to speak to Hitler. Chamberlain spoke to Hitler, and it came up with an agreement that Hitler thought that Chamberlain couldn't sail. That any area which had more than 50% of the population being German would go to Germany. Chamberlain incredibly managed to get France to agree. And they took this decision without talking to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, for all the strength of the fortresses in the Sudetenland, could not defend itself without French and British help. So, 23rd of September, Chamberlain goes back to Hitler and says, right, okay, France has agreed. Any area that has more than 50% of the people speaking German in Czechoslovakia goes over to you. Now, at that stage, Hitler came back and said, no, that's not enough. I want the whole Sudetenland. And Chamberlain realised, this man wants war. It doesn't matter what I offer him. It doesn't matter what I give him. He's going to keep asking for more. So Chamberlain then is realizes this is a crisis. We're heading towards war, and he wants to get war stopped. He goes back to Parliament and he calls this crisis a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Trying to calm the British people down, because what he doesn't want is the British people demanding more, although that was very unlikely at that stage. As things went on, though, by the 27th of September, Hermann Göring comes to Hitler. A top Nazi comes to Hitler and says, listen, you're going to have to negotiate. The people do not want war. The people realise there's a peaceful solution and they don't want war. And at that stage, you could actually argue that appeasement had worked. It had given the German people a way out of war. The German people wanted peace. Chamberlain had provided a peaceful way forward. And so Hitler was furious, but he had to give in, especially when Mussolini contacted Hitler and said, listen, you need to negotiate. And I'll host the negotiations. I'll sort this out for you. Mussolini was doing this under British pressure. But his chief ally, Mussolini, was not keen on war. One of his top government officials was telling him the German people don't want war. Hitler wanted war, but he had to give in. And so on the 29th to the 30th of September 1938, the Munich conference was held. Daladier from France, he was there. Chamberlain was there for Britain. Mussolini was there for Italy. Hitler was there for the German people. But Edward Beneš, the Czechoslovakia's leader, wasn't even invited. And the Soviet Union wasn't invited either. And that's going to become very, very important. The Soviet Union was left out of it. Now, the Soviet Union was a Czech ally. It could have given air support to Czechoslovakia, but it was not even included in the talks. And that was because at the time Stalin was busy, shooting most of his army's leaders. That was keeping him occupied. People thought that the Soviet Union wasn't really a major power. But Stalin heard the message. Britain and France don't take me seriously. Italy doesn't take me seriously. Germany doesn't take me seriously. The Soviet Union is considered weak. I must do something to make it look strong again. And that's going to lead to a deal between Hitler and Stalin in 1939. So excluding the Soviet Union was a massive mistake. Excluding Czechoslovakia was unfair, and it signalled to all the little countries in Eastern Europe that Hitler could threaten. Do what Hitler tells you, because nobody's coming to help. In terms of the deal, Hitler was to gain the whole Sudetenland. And he agreed to holding plebiscites in mixed areas of Czechoslovakia. And he promised to respect the independence of what was left of Czechoslovakia. In other words, he agreed in Munich, right, that is it. I'm not going to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. It's just the Sudetenland. And so Chamberlain comes back waving a little piece of paper in Britain saying, this is peace in our time. But Hitler wasn't satisfied. March 1939, he bullied Czechoslovakia into handing over the provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. This was the first time Hitler had taken over non-German territory. There weren't very many Germans there. He took them over. Days later, Slovakia, which was all that remained of Czechoslovakia, came under what they called German protection. It was a protectorate. In other words, it was a tiny little country that Hitler said, I'll protect it so long as you do what I say. It's a little bit like the mafia charging people protection money. The idea is, the gangster goes around and says, right, your business is going to pay me protection money. You pay me protection money and I will make sure no harm comes to your business. But the person you're most scared of is actually the mafioso, the gangster. And this was Hitler's relationship to Slovakia. Slovakia pretty much did exactly what Germany told it to. It was put under a guy called Tiso, T-I-S-O. Hitler then went to the little country of Lithuania and said, right, I want a place called Memel back. And Lithuania just handed it over because it was in no position to fight Germany. And so appeasement really, in the long run, by 1939, had failed. It just gave Hitler a chance to stand back, to regroup, and get ready for war again. The reasons for appeasement were that mainly the British people wanted peace. The British people weren't particularly interested in having a war in 1938. Also, that many of Hitler's complaints about the Sudetenland seemed reasonable. And that's important because Britain, if it was to go to war, had to rely on countries that were called the Dominions: Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Canada. Britain needed those guys in a time of war. They needed those countries to agree to fight, and they were all unlikely to go to war for Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain also felt that a strong Germany might protect Europe from Russia. Britain was not just worried, you see, about Germany. Britain, you have to remember, is a world empire. It has holdings, it has territory in the Far East, in Malaysia and Singapore. It also has India. And because it has all those territories in the Far East as part of its India, it needs to worry about Russia and Japan. So Chamberlain's looking at Europe, and he's not just worried about Germany, he's also worried about Stalin. What if Stalin gets his act together? What if Stalin gets a strong army? That could threaten my interests in India. What if the Japanese decide that China isn't the only place they're interested in conquering? What if the Japanese decide to have a go at India? What if they decide to have a go at Singapore? So Chamberlain's got more worries than just Hitler. And that means that peace suited him. The German people began to believe at this stage in the myth of Hitler because Hitler had given them 3 major victories: the Rhineland, he had given them Austria, and he had given them Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. And people began to admire Hitler. Appeasement did give Britain a chance to rearm. It gave the RAF and the Royal Navy both chances to rearm, and that was very important for British security. Part of the reason that Britain was able to survive in the Second World War was because Chamberlain bought that little bit of time for the RAF and the Royal Navy. So you could argue that appeasement both stopped war in 1938 and give Britain the chance it needed to rearm and protect itself. But in the long run, appeasement failed to prevent war. But Chamberlain knew that it would never ever stop war from breaking out. He was no fool. He knew whenever he went to Hitler and said initially, listen, you can have any area of Czechoslovakia where more than half the people speak German. And Hitler comes back and says that's not enough. At that stage, Chamberlain knew he was dealing with a man who was going to have war at any price. So what he had to do was slow Hitler down. And to that extent, appeasement worked. The speech, though, at the back that Chamberlain gave, I mentioned about a country, a faraway country of which we know nothing. The speech that he gave at that time said how horrible, how fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying us on gas masks because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. And what Chamberlain was referring to was the fact that in London at the time, gas masks were being handed out. People were digging trenches to protect themselves from bombing. Because you have to remember, over in Spain, Hitler had sent the Condor Legion and it had bombed civilian areas. And again, this was a way of terrorising other countries. Hitler was saying, if you go to war with me, I'll bomb your cities. So Chamberlain wasn't ready for that.